My name is Heavenly Bailey. I'm doing the Founding Father Project on John Rutledge Jr. Here's an image of the late John Rutledge Jr. John Rutledge Jr. is the son of the late John Rutledge Sr., who was a physician, and Sarah Boone Rutledge, who's an English decent, whose family is very well known for the Boone Hall plantation. He's the oldest out of 6 siblings. This is an image of the Boone Hall plantation. It housed many slaves. John Rutledge Jr. and his siblings gained their education from their father at an early age. At age 17, he found interest in law. He had 2 private tutors. Years later, he went to pursue his education at London's Middle Temple to gain his studies in law. After finishing law studies, he admitted to the English bar in 1760. Shortly after, he returned to Charleston, where pursuing business opportunities in agriculture. He quickly amassed a fortune in plantations and slaves, raising young men of the landowner class. Rutledge gravitated towards politics, winning election to the Providence Assembly in 1761, where he represented Christ Church Parish until the Revelation. This is the image of the law school he attended, London Middle Temple. John Rutledge Jr. married Elizabeth Grimke at the age of 24. Together they had 10 children. They lived in a townhouse in Charleston, South Carolina, where he spent most of his life. This is the image where John Rutledge Jr. raised his family in Charleston, South Carolina. This is a statue of John Rutledge Jr. as second Chief United States Supreme Court Justice. In 1761, John Rutledge Jr. began his political career. That year, on behalf of Christ Church Parish, he was elected to the Provincial Assembly. He held his seat until the War for Independence. For 10 months in 1764, he temporarily held the post for Provincial Attorney General. When the troubles with Great Britain intensified about the time of the Stamp Act in 1765. However, he chaired a committee of the Stamp Act Congress that drew up a petition to the House of Lords. In 1774, John Rutledge Jr. was sent to the First Continental Congress, where he pursued a moderate course. After spending next year in the Second Continual Congress, he returned to South Carolina and helped reorganize his government. In 1776, he served on the Committee of Safety and took part in the writing of the state constitution. That year, he also became president of the lower house of the legislation, a post he held until 1778. During this period, the new government met many sterile tests. In 1778, the conservative Rutledge, disapproving of Democratic revisions in the state constitution, resigned his position. The next year, however, he was elected as governor. The British were invading South Carolina and the military situation was desperate. Early in 1780, by which time the legislation had adjured Charleston In May it failed. The American army was captured and the British confiscated Rutledge's property. He ultimately escaped to North Carolina and set about attempting to rally forces to recover South Carolina. In 1781, aimed by General Nathanael Greene in a new continent army force, he reestablished the government. In January 1782, he resigned the governorship and took a seat in the lower house of the legislation and never recouped the financial losses he suffered during the war. In 1782 through 83, Rutledge was a delegate to the Continental Congress. He next seat on the state court and again the lower house of the legislation 1784 through 90, where he maintained a moderate nationalist sign and chaired the committee of detail. He attended all the sessions, spoke often and effectively, and served on 5 committees. Like his fellow South Carolina delegates, he advocated Southern interests. The new government under the Constitution soon lured Rutledge. He was a president-elector in 1789, and Washington then appointed him as the Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. But for some reason, he apparently served only a short time. In 1791, he became Chief Justice of South Carolina Supreme Court. 4 years later, again appointed him to the U.S. Supreme Court, this time as Chief Justice to replace John Jay. But Rutledge being outspoken to Jay's treaty in 1794, and then his mental health illness had took control of him since the death of his wife in 1792, caused that Federalist nominated Senate to reject his appointment and end his public career. And my question would be, why was he forced out of the office involuntarily ending his public career? This is a Constitutional Convention image of John Rutledge Jr. Why did Rutledge sign the Constitution? This is an image of the Stamp Act, where John Rutledge Jr. was the chair of a committee during the Stamp Act Congress. This is the image of the gravesite that the late John Rutledge Jr. was buried. He was buried at St. Michael Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. John Rutledge was very active in public life in South Carolina, serving in various legislation positions. He was first governor of South Carolina. He was also involved in national politics. He served as a South Carolina delegate to both Continental Congress, a delegate to the Federal Constitutional Convention.